Teaching acceleration mechanics is very different than top-end mechanics. The two skills need to be taught completely separately. Now, of course, there are many common things between the two, but you need to teach them separately because they're very different movements. They feel very different. They're going to have different corrections, different cues. Everything's going to be different about them. So the way I typically will teach acceleration mechanics is by first talking about what part of the foot to land on. We're going to go through drills for that. Talk about how high their knees should get, talk about long impulses, and then really in general, we're going to practice these things over and over to get an athlete to feel what it should feel like. We'll use video feedback fairly often on just a simple phone app or an iPad app so that athletes can see what they're doing, and you can play that back for them and then they can make the correction. So the things that we're looking for when you're teaching acceleration mechanics are almost the very first thing you need to introduce to the athlete is the idea of having a good forward lean. So what I will explain is if this is my head, these are my feet, and I'm running this way, your whole body should be leaning forward. You are not bent at the waist. The lean comes essentially from the feet, and you're leaning forward. The hips need to go with it so that you're not pushing your butt out. So that good forward lean is going to allow athletes to put the force backwards. In order to get the force driving backwards into the ground, the knees have to come up high out in front of them, higher than at top-end mechanics. And for the first couple of steps, in some cases, you are going to coach kids to get their knees up higher and higher and higher. It's not so much that we're trying to get them up higher, like straight up. It's more out in front of them so that they can elongate their strides. Elongating their strides is going to allow them to push backwards farther and harder. So all of the force that we're trying to create when you're accelerating should be going into the ground backwards. So when you're at top end speed or teaching top end speed, the foot is landing almost underneath them or underneath their center of mass. Now that we are leaning forward and accelerating, their feet should be landing behind their center of mass for the first couple of steps. Now when I talk about acceleration mechanics, I'm mainly talking about the first 4 steps. That's what we're going to concentrate on, and that's going to be the basis for our acceleration mechanics training. Really, it may be more like 5 or 6 steps, but the first 4 steps pretty much will set everything up. The first step is going to set the other steps up. So the first step is generally the most important step. For you to teach the first step, you're going to want to make sure that they understand the idea of a good forward lean. They're going to need to understand the concept of applying force backwards to move forwards. And from there, you're going to start teaching them how to apply that force most appropriately. Now, for us as coaches, we understand that some of this is just simply some basic physics principles. We need to push one direction to then travel in the opposite direction. A lot of kids will understand that simple physics concept. Sometimes they don't, and when you're talking to kids who understand it, I like to bring in the Flintstones. I know it sounds silly, and not all kids these days are going to understand what the Flintstones is, but you can relate it to them in different ways. So a kid who knows what the Flintstones is and has seen the show before, you can say, all right, who's seen the Flintstones? How does Fred Flintstone drive his car? And kids will say, oh, he pushes with his feet. You could also say, if you're riding your bike and you have no pedals, what do you do? And they'll get the idea of pushing. You may also say, if you're on a skateboard or a longboard or a scooter, what do you do? And they get the idea of pushing backwards. Then you can ask them, how does Fred Flintstone stop his car? And most kids will say, oh, he puts his feet down out in front of them, and they get the idea that putting something in front of them is going to stop them, and pushing backwards is going to propel them forward. It's going to be the same thing on a scooter. They're going to kind of drag their feet on the ground out in front of them, or on a skateboard, or with their feet on a bike. If they don't have any brakes, they're going to put their feet kind of and slide them out in front of them. You want them to understand that putting your feet out in front of you and landing on your heels, that's brakes. Staying on the ball of your foot and driving backwards, that's basically putting the gas on. So in order to put the gas on, you first have to get that lean forward, you got to get your knees up, and you have to drive backwards. Another mistake that we'll see a lot of kids make is when they come out of the gate on their first couple steps, they're trying to take really fast steps. At some point in their life, some coach told them, you got to come out with really, really fast steps. That's almost the opposite of what you want to teach when you're trying to accelerate in a straight line. We know from physics that a longer impulse is going to overcome inertia better than shorter impulses. Essentially, the harder and longer you push backwards into the ground, the farther you're going to travel forward in the opposite direction. You can relate this to kids by saying, all right, have you ever pushed a car? And some kids have pushed a car or something really heavy. We know that if you're going to go push a car, you're not going to take a bunch of teeny little steps. You're going to start out by driving backwards. You're going to take some slow steps, and they're gradually going to get faster and faster and faster. It's the same concept with acceleration mechanics. The first couple steps are going to be long. We're trying to cover some ground. We're trying to overcome inertia and create a little bit of momentum. And then the steps are going to increase, and your turnover is going to rapidly increase. It's going to feel kind of funny at first to get the knees up as high as we want them, and I'll demonstrate when we start going through these drills, we'll demonstrate why it's important to get the knees up so that you can continue pushing backwards. So for now and for the basics of acceleration mechanics, you want to think about forward lean, getting their knees up, and driving backwards. Those are kind of the three most important points that we want to make when we are trying to work on acceleration mechanics. So now I'm going to kind of bring it to life a little bit. So we've already covered top-end mechanics. We've talked about arm swing. We understand the idea of staying on the balls of your feet. But for acceleration mechanics, it's going to be slightly different. So I'm going to bring Jake in, and I'm going to go through some teaching progressions for teaching acceleration mechanics. We're mainly going to work on the first couple steps for this section. So Jake, what I want you to do is we talked about being on the balls of your feet and having rigid ankles. So these rigid ankles are something that you're going to be hammering home over and over again as a coach. Some people will use the term dorsiflexion. Others will say knees up, toes up. Some people will talk about bringing your foot up. If you bring your foot up right now and pretend like your ankle's in a cast. Some kids that have had their ankles in a cast understand that they can't move. And sometimes when their foot is dangling, you can just push down slightly on their toe, and they get the idea of creating a more rigid ankle by essentially flexing the muscles in their shin to keep their toes up. We want the ankles to be rigid so that when the foot hits the ground, instead of when they're pointed, the foot hits the ground and it then has to decelerate. We want to eliminate as much of the decelerating or the joint movement as possible. We want to keep it really rigid so that when it hits, the joint doesn't have to deform. It just sends all that power into the ground and then propels them forward. So to work on knees up, toes up, and to get the idea of applying force in the ground through that rigid ankle, I'm going to teach Jake how to do foot poppers. So I'm going to have you stand on your left foot, and have you bring your right knee up nice and high, and we're going to make sure that his knee is bent nice and tight so that his shin is basically pointing down towards the ground. I want you now, Jake, to drive your right foot down through the ground, through the ball of your foot one time. I'm going to have your knee slightly bent. So you can ask kids before they do this, what's going to happen? If your knee is slightly bent and the other foot hits the ground through the ball of the foot nice and hard, what's going to happen? Some kids will just inherently get the idea that, oh, I'm pushing down, so I'm going to go straight up. That's what we want them to do. So all I'm going to have you do is just drive down to the ground, and you're going to kind of pop yourself up a little bit. Try that for me. Good. So you don't have to jump with your left leg. Just use your right leg and drive through the ground. Perfect. Perfect. Let's do it again. Good. Now, this is a drill that should be used as a teaching drill. You can use it as a training drill later with older athletes, but for the most part, you're working on teaching an athlete how to maintain a rigid ankle and how to attack the ground through the ball of their foot. You don't want to do too many reps of this because it's a very, very intense plyometric exercise. There's a lot of force going through the foot, through the Achilles, even up through the knee. So you don't need to do like dozens and dozens of reps. Generally, you're going to do 5 to 10 reps on each leg so that the athlete gets the feel for what it's like to drive through that rigid ankle. All right, once he gets that idea, I'm going to have you turn facing this way. I'm going to have you get yourself up in that same starting position, so knees up and toes up. And what I'm going to have him do is I'm going to have him lean forward. As he leans forward, he's going to pull his knee up even higher, and before he feels like he's going to hit the ground, he's going to drive his foot backwards. So what we're doing right now, it's going to feel kind of funny. You can relax for a second. It's going to feel kind of funny for most athletes at first, but it all kind of comes together after a few reps. So what we're working on is getting them to lean forward, keep their knees up, and get the feeling of where they should be applying the force backwards. So for right now, your knees up, toes up. As you fall forward, lift that knee up and just one time kind of pop it backwards. All right? So knee up, toe up, fall forward, bring your knee up and then drive it back. Good, perfect. Perfect. And you can see he sprung off the ground. That's what we want. We want to see athletes spring off the ground and pop forward. Now, some athletes are going to hit the ground in just terrible places. So they're going to put their feet out in front of them. They're going to put it too far back behind them. They're not going to drive hard. It's going to be a real soft push down in the ground. So they're not going to get the feel for it. So for most athletes, we're going to do this over and over and over again, one step at a time. So you have them start here, they lean forward, they take one step, they decelerate, they come up, they take one step, and you're just working on the ability to feel what it should feel like through the ball of their foot driving backwards. We'll do that over and over again until they get that concept. We'll also explain to them that they really have to get their knees up as high as they can to increase the forward lean. So Jake, come on back over here. And I just want you to turn towards the camera, and I'm going to show kind of what I mean by this. So I'm just going to use you as a wall, so kind of get yourself nice and stable. So if my knee is up at about 90 degrees, when I lean forward here, my foot is up, a little bit off the ground. If I can get my foot up even higher, now I can lean even farther forward. If my toe is pointed and my knee's not up very high, now as I'm leaning forward, my foot's almost to the ground. The idea of getting your knees up in front of you is so that you can travel farther on each step. So the higher you get your knee up and out of it basically is getting out of the way so that your back foot can push longer and harder. So we want to maximize how long and hard we can push backwards by getting the knee up and out in front of us. Your knee has to be bent tightly so that, I'm going to use you again, so that if your foot is out like this, I'm probably going to land on my heel. But if I can get my knee tucked back, now I'm going to be driving backwards. So this forward leaning drill, the foot popper drill as you're leaning forward, is going to help athletes get a better feel of how far they can lean, how high they need to get their knee up, and where their foot should land. So I'm going to have you just do it one more time to demonstrate it. All right, so why don't you step, just right there. I'm going to have you do it one time coming back this way. Knee up, toe up. Really get your knee up as you fall forward. Good, good. So that's another key to that, is making sure that as they fall forward, they lift that knee up at the last second to really get a good spread between their knees, and it allows them to lean farther forward and to continue accelerating and moving forward. After they get one step, now we're going to go into two steps. So we can just start right here. You're going to start up like this. You're going to lean forward, take one step, another step, and then you're going to decelerate yourself. Great. Perfect. All right, so what we're working on now is just adding a second step. Most athletes by this point will get the idea of having their first step, having a big knee pushing backwards nice and hard, but the second step doesn't come quite as naturally. So we will do several reps of 2 steps. When they can get 2 steps, generally we'll now go into 4 steps. 4 steps, like I mentioned before, is kind of that is acceleration mechanics. So what I'm going to have Jake do is just demonstrate one time, starting, you can start right where you are, starting from that top position with your knee up, toe up, lean forward, really get your knee up high, and take 4 steps as hard as you can. 1, 2, 3, 4. Beautiful, beautiful. All right, so what Jake does a great job of doing is is actually covering ground on every single step. So he's allowing his back foot to push hard into ground, getting his knee up out of the way so he can cover plenty of ground. You're going to see a lot of athletes not doing that. And that's where video feedback comes in, because he may feel like he's doing it right, but he's not. And if he can't see that visually, especially with today's athlete who is all about visual feedback, if they can't see that, they're not going to know exactly what to correct. So I'll encourage you to use that video feedback. All right, from there are lots of drills that you can do to enhance that and to get them to feel it, but that's kind of the basics of teaching an athlete how to take the first step, the second step, and all the way through 4 steps.